Do you believe America is heading into an era of enlightenment and prosperity for all? Do you trust your fellow Americans to do the right thing when it comes to things like taking care of the poor, the homeless, or the immigrant? Let me give you a number. 26%. That's how many Americans right now believe that most people can be trusted. Now, in 1972, that number was 49%. Half the country gone. That's not a social trend. That's a cultural collapse of epic proportion. And today I want to show you what that collapse actually looks like in numbers, in policy, and in the lives of 42 million Americans who are one signature away from losing the one thing standing between them and nothing. This is 50 years of rot, and what happens when entitlement collides with decline. Now let me start with the foundation, because everything else rests on this. In 1979, American manufacturing employed 19.4 million workers. That's Bureau of Labor Statistics data. That's their numbers. Today, 12.8 million. That is 6.6 million jobs, not lost to recession, not automated away, offshored, deliberately, by policy decisions made in Washington and in corporate boardrooms over 5 decades. And here's what they don't tell you about that number. Those weren't just jobs. Those were union jobs, pension jobs, jobs that paid a man or a woman enough to buy a house in town where they could send their kids to a decent school, take a week's vacation in July, and retire with some dignity intact. They didn't just export the work, they exported the foundation. And when the foundation goes, everything built on top of it starts to lean. Now let's talk about some research. Pew Research back in 2023. They said in 1971, 61% of American adults lived in what they defined as the middle class. The broad, stable, working and productive middle. 2-car garage, a summer vacation, with kids who would do a little better than their parents. Today, that number is 50% and falling fast. Think about that using basic math. 330 million Americans. 11% of them is 36 million people. 36 million people who used to be middle class and now are either working poor, financially dependent, or one medical bill away from free fall. That's not volatility. That's the structural collapse of a first world economy. And here's the part that makes this undeniable. Real wages, your actual purchasing power, adjusted for inflation, are lower today than they were in the early 1970s. That's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The receipt, the same items my mother bought in 1975 would cost her $47. Today, that's about $127. That's an $80 gap. That's not a supply chain problem. That's not COVID. That's 50 years of living above our means. Americans believed they were special, privileged, entitled to live a life far above the living standards of any other nation in history. They somehow deserved it. Those days are gone. And those privileged and entitled people cannot understand what happened. So what they needed was someone to blame. That someone turns out to be the poor, the outcast, and the homeless. And we can't forget the immigrant. Now a battle has begun between the have and have-nots. A battle over dwindling resources. Resources the richest of the rich want to keep for themselves. They must do this without drawing the attention of the unwashed masses. They needed a scapegoat, so they made a plan. That plan was simple and has been executed perfectly by every politician and president that has been in office for over 50 years. Blame the poor, the homeless, the immigrant for our problems. They are the ones stealing middle-class wealth. This strategy, though, can only work when empathy for the less fortunate is dead. So, as the economy slowly implodes, the trust Americans once had with each other is fading. You can rebuild an economy. History has shown that. What you cannot easily rebuild is trust. And the data on American social trust is catastrophic. Gallup and the General Social Survey are both tracking the same collapse. When Americans were asked, can most people be trusted? In 1972, 49% of the people said yes. Today, that's dwindled down to 26%. Less than 1 in 4 Americans believes the person sitting next to them can be trusted. And then you look at the institutions. Trust in Congress, 9%. You're hearing that right, 9%. The trust in the presidency across all recent surveys, between 26 and 34%. Trust in the media, 18%. These are not partisan numbers. These are the numbers of a country that has lost confidence in its own institutions, in its own neighbors, in itself. For instance, one neighbor is angry with another because they had heard that they were receiving SNAP benefits. An immigrant family down the street is being watched because people believe they are getting thousands of dollars from the U.S. government each and every month. Welcome to the new climate of distrust, a petri dish in which the next piece of our theory incubated. Now here's what they didn't tell you. Every piece of evidence I just walked you through, the manufacturing collapse, the middle class erosion, the trust implosion, that all predates 2016. This is a problem that didn't happen overnight. It's as old as time. I know what some of you are thinking right now, so don't blame one president. Don't blame Donald Trump. This started long before him. I hear you, and you are right that it did start long before him. But here's what the evidence actually shows about what happened next. You see, a movement needs a leader, and people under sustained economic stress, people who feel betrayed, disrespected, and discarded, become susceptible to specific kinds of politics, need a specific kind of leader. The politics of someone who validates their anger, names an enemy, tells them their failures are not their fault, and crucially, gives them permission to act on impulses they had been suppressing for years. Psychologists call this the uninhibition effect. When someone in authority models a behavior, the social prohibition against that behavior drops for everyone watching. Think about it this way. You're watching a leader you trust. Maybe you admire them. Maybe you just agree with them on one big issue. Then they do something subtle but powerful. They go after somebody, not just criticize their policy, but mock them, insult them, and strip them down to something less than human. You also hated that person being criticized, but instead of thinking that leader went way too far in his attacks, you felt relieved. That's the permission slip being signed in real time. All holds are barred. An enemies list has been created, and it's time for you to join in on the attacks. So what happened in 2016 was not simply a political election. It was the release of 50 years of pressure, 50 years of staying quiet, 50 years of seeing people who didn't deserve getting government assistance, getting health insurance, or special treatment because they're a minority. Finally, you can release that bent-up anger, and that release valve had a name, Donald Trump. But I don't want you to take my word for any of this. I want you to look at the actual policy record, the ledger. 42 million Americans currently receive SNAP food assistance. 42 million. This is more people than the entire population of California. The big beautiful bill cut between 13 and 16 million people from that program through the end of 2026. That's the Congressional Budget Office's numbers. That's their estimate, not mine. These are not abstractions. These are people already at the absolute margin. Now let's talk about Medicaid. 90 million Americans are enrolled in Medicaid and CHIP. Those are seniors in nursing homes, children, people living with disabilities, working adults in expansion states. Proposed cuts over 10 years, $880 billion. That's CBO numbers. $880 billion divided by 90 million people over 10 years, that is $977 per person per year, less than $82 a month for people whose medical costs cannot fit inside any budget you hand them. And the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, 21 million Americans gained health care coverage under the ACA. They have been living with that coverage for over a decade, building their lives around it. When you remove health care from 21 million people, you are not making a budget decision. You're making a life and death decision, and you're making it deliberately. That is the ledger. If you believe this content helps you get a better understanding of the issues facing our world, please subscribe right now. And while you're at it, hit the like button and share the video with others who you believe need to know the truth. Let's get on with the video. Now let's talk about our international relations. Here's the view from the outside. Gallup's annual Global Leadership Report, real data gathered over multiple years. It says here that in 2016, the United States had a global approval rating of 48% among allied nations and trading partners. As early as 2026, the median global approval rating has dropped to 31%. And the current diplomatic turbulence over the Iran war, the tariff wars, alliance friction, and unilateral policy reversals is tracking at a similar or lower level today. Understand what that means. American power has always been two things: military capability and soft power. The credibility to lead, the respect of allies, the caution of adversaries. When Donald Trump torched the soft power, we are left with only military power. And a nation that governs only by force is not a republic. It's a garrison. So here's what the theory shows us about the domestic coalition that formed to elect Donald Trump. It's not primarily ideological. It is performative. It is a cultural grant of permission. Permission to do what was once unacceptable in public life. To demean, to exclude, to celebrate cruelty as a form of strength. And once a culture grants that permission widely enough, loudly enough, in front of enough children, the next generation of leaders does not need to hide it anymore. That is not politics. That is a cultural fracture. Fracture line number 1, economic. The federal debt has crossed $39 trillion. The annual interest payment on that debt, the cost of servicing what we already owe, now exceeds the entire defense budget. We are paying more to service old borrowing than to protect ourselves. Every serious economist across the political spectrum agrees on the math. But when it will break and who gets stuck holding the bill? Fracture line number 2, institutional. When 9% of Americans trust Congress, Congress loses the ability to govern. Not the authority, the ability. A government that the people no longer believe in cannot make hard decisions. The illegal war of choice against Iran is an example. The Constitution tells us that only Congress can declare war. But $60 billion later, the U.S. is mired in a conflict in the Middle East that is literally destroying the global economy. This happens while Congress sits and debates passing the War Powers Act, a legislation that in itself is unconstitutional. The government does not fix structural problems. They export them to the next generation, to the next president, or the next crisis. Fracture line number 3, social. When trust among citizens falls below 30%, historians and sociologists have a specific term for what typically follows. It is not a civil war in the Hollywood sense. It's called fragmentation. Communities that stop cooperating, states that stop complying, regions that build a separate identity, their own identity, separate, parallel, and increasingly hostile to the national one. We will begin to see this in the battles between red and blue states as we continue down this road. Fracture line number 4, global. When allies stop trusting your consistency, they build alternatives. Not immediately, but they are beginning to build them now. The European defense narrative, under negotiation. The expanse of bilateral trade agreements that excludes the dollar, happening right now. The BRICS alternative payment system, it's online right now and being used. The quiet accumulation of gold reserves by central banks that used to trust U.S. treasuries. That's happening right now and has been happening for many years. Empires do not fall in a day. They lose relevance, slowly, then suddenly. And here is what the prediction shows clearly. The American empire is failing. Even if the current administration changed course tomorrow, the damage to institutional trust, to international credibility, and to the social contract between this government and its people requires at least a generation to repair, at a minimum. There is no executive order for trust. There is no legislation for social cohesion. The egg does not uncrack. I want to be precise about this because precision is what separates analysis from opinion. The economic decline we're witnessing began before 2016. The social trust collapse began before 2016. The institutional rot began well before 2016. But Donald Trump's presidency has dramatically increased the rate of decline through 2026. Gone are the guardrails that once limited what a president could say. Gone are the days of empathy as the administration deliberately targets the programs that keep the most vulnerable Americans from complete economic freefall. 42 million people eating because of SNAP, 90 million people with health care through Medicaid, 21 million who could see a doctor because the Affordable Care Act existed. These are not budget line items. These are the load-bearing walls of society. And once you remove those load-bearing walls, the ceiling doesn't fall immediately. It creaks, it bows, and then one day, without warning, it comes down all at once. The trajectory is now set. The fracture lines are not theoretical. They are measurable, documented, and accelerating. The signal has been given, and no election by itself changes the structural math underneath it. No one is coming to save you. You need to know the truth. You need to be prepared. Let me tell you what this evidence tells me. America was not sabotaged overnight. This is the accumulation of 50 years of decisions. Decisions made in boardrooms, in congressional chambers, and in Federal Reserve meeting rooms that steadily transferred wealth upward, shipped strength overseas, and told working people of this country to work harder, spend more, and be grateful for what little they have left. The resentment is real. The anger is real. But resentment and anger without direction becomes destruction. The people who Donald Trump pointed to as enemies are just people, non-enemies of the state. They are mostly poor and vulnerable, what Jesus would call the least of these. But every tyrant needs an enemy. The once privileged and entitled people of America found a leader that allowed them to openly hate their enemy. They handed over the keys to our country to a man that was willing to declare war on the homeless, the poor, and the immigrant. And that war he started was not a political war. It was a cultural one. Political wars can be extinguished by the next election. Cultural wars, on the other hand, wars in the soul of people, those burn for generations. The evidence is in. The theory is documented. The prediction is visible to anyone willing to look at the numbers without flinching. America is fracturing. And not because of one man, because one man gave a fractured people permission to blame someone else. Go find an enemy somewhere, a homeless man in the street, an immigrant working in a field, or a single parent getting food stamps. The damage is done. The question now is what you will do with that truth. If this signal reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not because it's comfortable to share, but because they deserve to understand what is actually happening before they can do anything about it. I'm David Tomsic, and this is Clear Signal. I'll see you next time. Stay sharp.